Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm speaking to a business school professor whose research highlights the benefits of thinking counterintuitively. My guest, Ian McCarthy, has been on the show before, talking about his research into workplace bullshit. There's a link to that episode in the show notes. And since we last heard from Ian, lots has happened in the field of bullshit. So I begin by getting an update from him and some insights into how large companies are working with Ian on bullshit audits. And no, that's not a tautology. We then go on to explore the first of several counterintuitive ideas that emerged from Ian's research. If you're a company and you own some intellectual property, your logo or brand imagery, for example, then conventional wisdom says that you should pursue anyone who tries to infringe your rights. But there are many situations where that might not actually be the best thing to do, particularly if it's your customers and biggest fans who are the ones doing the infringing, which is where the idea of open IP comes into play. As Ian explains, companies might actually want to actively support these superfans in doing their infringing. How and why is something we look at. After that, we move into the field of social media, and I get Ian's thoughts on how companies and individuals might respond to it. Amongst other insights, Ian highlights how far from thinking of social media as a risk to be mitigated, there are counterintuitive strategies available to companies. Why might you, for example, want to use it to leak information that historically might have been considered trade secrets? Then we move to Ian's own field, and he explains why he's a huge proponent of open academia. It's another concept that involves overturning conventional wisdom. You'll hear what it is and why it can have such a huge impact. Finally, we look ahead at some of the other areas of work Ian is exploring. It's a really eclectic mix of research into subjects as diverse as misconduct in research, essentially cheating in academia, voting patterns in the elections for the world's best football player. European listeners will recognise the dynamic he explores from the Eurovision Song Contest. And finally, how to flexibly reconfigure hospitals to make them able to cope with the demands of COVID. It's not your standard mix of work, but as Ian says, he's not your typical business school professor. And that's why I really enjoyed recording, and I know you're going to enjoy listening to, this wide-ranging episode with Professor Ian McCarthy on the business of being counterintuitive. Ian, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks, Christian. It's wonderful to be back.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you back. And you were one of the earlier guests on the show. And last time we spoke, we talked a lot of bullshit, which people that haven't listened to it is not a reflection of the quality of Ian's conversation, but rather the research area he's looking at. Look, since speaking to you, my social media has been full of it. And people have been talking about your ideas. How has that progressed since we last spoke?
So the original article I wrote with colleagues about bullshit was sort of almost like what we call a practitioner piece. We take sort of concepts, and we wanted to tell the world, that bullshit's different from lying, make you think about how dangerous it can be, how people react to it, and maybe how you should treat it. And so since then, because of the interest in that work, we've started some more studies, empirical studies, where we're actually working with a couple of very, very large organizations, in one case, one of the largest organizations in the world, who are surveying their employees. We developed a scale for measuring the extent to which bullshit is flowing within an organization, the extent to which and we could use this to identify whether marketing has more than accounting and whether engineering has less than science, within the divisions, functional divisions, regional divisions. And as I said, a couple of large organizations have asked us to test, validate, and use that scale as part of surveys that they do as part of HR initiatives, whether it be engagement services, psychological surveys, and they want to sort of see which parts of the organizations feel psychologically the most safe and the least safe, and how that relates to what they perceive as the levels of bullshit flowing within those organizations. So it's got even more interesting and hopefully useful and important.
And that's fascinating. So the presumption being that there's enough of it in the organization that's worth measuring, at least not necessarily across it, but in parts of it. And this is something that we ought to take an interest in because implicitly it's not a good thing.
Yes, implicitly, generally, it would be, it raises issues of trust and and safety to one extent. But it's important to recognize there are different types of bullshit. And, if you're in a part of an organization which is very entrepreneurial, very innovative, and you need to make sense of really uncertain futures, it's very hard to always make every statement grounded in truth and evidence. A lot of it is envisioning. And so there are, there are a number of caveats that with regards to whether it's always bad, but there is a general assumption that, it encroaches on truth and respect and authenticity, and these get in the way of leading and directing organizations in the way that you want to go.
So it's a friction on the kind of business that you would want, and therefore we should seek to eliminate it to the extent that we can. I think it's fascinating as you were talking, because I was thinking, well, maybe you'd have a sort of bullshit map, I guess, to see where is this prevalent, where is it not. And almost implicitly, if there's not enough of that coming out of the sort of the R&D innovation function, maybe you'd want to, I don't say you want to encourage that, but that'd be something to look at. You might expect some of it in the marketing function for given what they do, but that's a sort of interesting reading of the culture of the organization.
Yeah, and you'd imagine that certain parts of public relations in an organization, marketing, logically, from a hypothesis perspective, you would say, they may be greater sources, and we'd like to actually show that. And people would say, that was obvious. But then once you know that's the case, then you might be able to understand, to what extent it gets bad, to what extent it's acceptable and useful within organizations. You would hope there's a lot less in science when they're doing clinical trials of drugs, in terms of wounds, and so and you would hope that that's a lot less intolerant to that type of communications and statements and decision making that goes on. And so, and again, if we were to show that would obviously not be too unsurprising and hopefully reassuring, but it helps us to understand the different flows and the different types of BS within organizations and what that means for different outcomes and different results.
Fascinating. I'll be watching that with interest and then encouraging you to go take a look at politics, which seems to me has plenty of potential, although you may be overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
One of the things that caught my eye from your social media feed, and I highly recommend people follow you because it is a really eclectic mix of things that you're involved with, but also other things that pique your curiosity. And one of the things that really intrigued me was you've done some work on looking at intellectual property and really challenging the traditional presumption that companies should pursue people that infringe their IP. And you had some lovely stories. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of the research and what you found.
So I'll step back and talk about the background. One of my areas of research is innovation, and within the field of innovation, a very prominent and popular and important area is what we call open innovation. And open innovation was the term and was popularized, and much of the early research on this was done by a gentleman called Henry Chesbrough, who's at Berkeley University, Business School at Berkeley University. And in fact, Henry and I teach together at Lewis University in Rome, and we teach a course on innovation. And so Henry coined this term open innovation, which is basically saying, organizations don't employ all the smart people in R&D departments. They don't employ all the smart people in design departments. And increasingly, organizations should learn from beyond their boundaries. And this includes everything from licensing to acquiring companies to partnerships to, and it's about licensing out and licensing in, spinning out firms and acquiring firms. And it gives this sense that there are purposeful flows of knowledge inside and outside the organization, which are central to innovating. It's not just that you must be secret and you must be, controlling all leaks. In fact, you actually encourage leaks to some extent, and they're controlled leaks. And within this, one of the sources of knowledge for open innovation is users, and users broadly being firms who use your products and services, consumers who use your products and services, professionals like doctors, lawyers, who use your products, and they're often messing around with your products and services, and improving them. They're adjusting them and modifying them, and they're improving them. And so the research on open innovation and user innovation within open innovation generally says it's a good thing, and that you should let users mess around with your products. And then recently I was building on my work on user innovation with some marketing colleagues, and we're looking at Anna, a law professor, Jeremy De Beer, who's at Ottawa University, and Karen Robson, who's at the University of Windsor in Canada, who's a marketing professor. And we were looking at what happens to so innovation scholars get open innovation managers get open innovation, but we didn't think lawyers within organizations or marketing scholars got it as well, and they didn't really. And we wanted to understand some sort of examples of how they had reacted to users messing around. And so what we looked at all these cases of how people took a firm's product or service and messed around with it and modified it. So I'll give you a very simple example. A section of the world likes and can afford Burberry clothing. So people who have high incomes and money to spend on the Burberry brand like the Burberry check and like the Burberry clothing. There's also a section of the world who can't necessarily afford it and also love it. Working class football supporters, for example, and other youth segments in society. And Burberry was seeing that people were using the Burberry brand in ways they didn't like. And one example was some young teenagers who took their sort of cheap, fairly old car, I think it was a Vauxhall Cavalier, and they completely covered it in the Burberry check. And they were driving around proud of this creation. They had done this. They loved Burberry, and they loved their creation, and they were really happy driving around proud as ever, with this innovation. It was a user innovation. But Burberry was not so happy. Burberry did not like the creation per se, and it did not like the users who was doing it. It's not its target audience. So Burberry got its lawyers together and sent out cease and desist orders to have these vehicles destroyed and crushed. Now, on the other hand, and so that Burberry's IP in this case was not the car, it was the Burberry check. And when you look at Gucci, for example, Gucci has arrangements with Fiat where they can put the Gucci logo on some of the cars, and it's a sort of cross-branding initiative, and that's all highly controlled. And Gucci likes it that Fiat does it, and Fiat likes it that Gucci allows it. Now, another example would be J.K. Rowling. So J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books, she allows people to use her intellectual property. She allows people to write their own novels using all of the characters, trademarked, copyright characters in the books, because she, in the same way as the Burberry car makers, love Burberry, she's happy that these people love her intellectual property. And she, with a small number of rules, and I think the rules are maybe that you include things like you can't write books that involve pornography or very inappropriate storylines, but she likes it that individuals, users, fans, as a homage, are actually, and so these are two different sides. And so we went out and we just collected case studies and studied these case studies and wanted to make sense of them. And then from all these sort of offer managers, particularly marketing managers and lawyers within firms, sort of recommendations about how they should respond to unauthorized use of intellectual property. And so that's the background, very long background there.
I find it fascinating because it's a dynamic that you can't ignore. Right? It is going on, and almost by implication, if you've spent a lot of money promoting something, the marketer's dream is that people love the product and that people get passionate about it. And we see companies, Apple would be a good example, Peloton maybe another one, of people that are fans of the product. It goes way beyond just being a purchaser of it. You become an evangelist for it. So there's it's almost what the marketing is encouraging. And then you face this dynamic of, whoa, that's just gone in a way that we didn't quite expect. And you have to control it. And I'm fascinated by you. I mean, you picked some extreme examples there, one of which seems very enlightened, the other of which seems very old school. And how does one strike the balance between those two things?
And when I teach this with MBA students and executives, we go through and we try to sort of say, was Burberry, wrong to do what they did? And is J.K. Rowling enlightened to do what they do? And we go through and the answer is always it depends. And it depends on understanding questions to do with the desirability of the creative act and the desirability of the creative consumer. And so J.K. Rowling, she has some caveats, but she's generally very happy with the creative act. And she's also very happy with the people who are doing it. And so she's happy for people to mess around with, modify, adapt, and evolve her intellectual property. Whereas Burberry, given the sort of organization it is, given the sort of people who wear Burberry, and traditionally and currently, and you think about Burberry as a very it's a classic, conservative, timeless brand. And so, and because Burberry's been so worried about how people use and modify its the classic Burberry check, even Burberry itself, in terms of its innovations and its product lines, if you go into a Burberry store now and compare it with 10, 15 years ago, there is a lot less check on all of the items. They've reduced it, they've scaled it back because they've been worried about it. And so they're very controlling. And in some ways, in this particular example, you would say maybe it's appropriate, like it makes sense. I'll give you another example of which makes less sense, where some people called cosplayers is a combination of two words, costume players. And these are people who dress up and they wear clothes that sort of reflect characters in comics or TV shows, often very much science fiction orientated. But there was a cosplay community interested in sort of, celebrating Pokemon. They love Pokemon, and they organized a party, a very, private, yes, it was advertised in their local region and on sort of Pokemon websites. But they said, come to our house, we're having a large dress up. Everyone's going to wear cosplay costumes, which reflect Pokemon. And we're going to charge, like a small entrance fee of $10 to cover some food and beverages. It certainly wasn't a commercial money-making venture.
So they're not running a theme park, for example.
Yeah, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like you're running a theme park. It wasn't like Comic Con. It was a small. Anyway, Pokemon got to hear about this and contacted the organizers of the party with their lawyers, and again issued cease and desist orders and a bill for their lawyers actually writing this cease and desist letter. So the organizers of the Pokemon costume party, who love Pokemon so much so that they build their own costumes, design and make them, they canceled the party, they refunded the money to people who were going to attend, and then they started a sort of crowdfunding campaign to raise money to pay the bill that Pokemon wanted them to pay for the legal fees. And there was an enormous backlash of people saying, this is crazy. Why would Pokemon treat, people who love the brand and love the intellectual property and love the characters so much? Why would you treat them this way? What is the harm? And so when you compare that to the Burberry example, it does seem, like it hasn't been well considered. It does seem like, maybe they should have been more like J.K. Rowling in terms of allowing this, or, other Marvel Comics who have no issues, and Star Wars who have no issues with people going to Comic-Con and dressing up and organizing events.
And I mean, it struck me that the company that's been doing this for some time, and I think part of its rebirth came from this, is Lego, where there's a very clear view that the product lends itself to that. But nonetheless, this is a company that's very, very alert to licensing arrangements because they strike them themselves. So they've got that but yet they're very fluid in terms of their own customer base. And that struck me as being a really interesting example of someone I think got it quite early on and was thinking about this.
Lego has a whole history of it. So Lego and open innovation, and in particular user innovation, less so from a branding and IP perspective, but has been very engaging with users. If you look at the aspect or the division of Lego which produces the robotic Lego, and originally, they worked with researchers in the US, I think at MIT, and they said, what control systems do we need, and what software systems do we need, and how do we create, these robotic Lego packages that we can, and that's a sort of somewhat, it's open innovation because you're working with MIT, but then they went much more open and they allowed people to actually build communities where people said, this is what you can do with this. This is how you can make your phone control it. This is how you make your Samsung phone control it. This is how you can build robots with other pieces of technology. And so it became much more of a community-based rather than sort of linking to sort of experts in one of the world's leading universities. And so Lego's always done this, and it's always allowed people maybe to design and build their own kits. They've have the photograph booths where you can go in and have your photograph of you and your dog, or you and your wife, or you and your children, and then it will print out of this photographic booth a collection of black and white and grey pieces, which you then build, a bit like the images behind you, which are pixelated images, of people, the Beatles by the look of it. And so Lego allowed you to do that. Lego wanted you to be in the sort of co-design and co-development process. They were very open. I think they would have issues, if you were messing around with the arrangements they have with Star Wars or Disney and the licensing deals they have, but they don't mind you using the Lego pieces to mess around with other people's IP. And I think one of the things with open innovation is we tend to think about open innovation in terms about being designs and being IP. So when we think about intellectual property, we tend to think about patents and designs. And so as innovation managers and innovation scholars, that was what most of the work on open innovation focused on, patents and designs. But when you look at the world of intellectual property and the value of intellectual property, trademarks and copyrights are even bigger, and they're much more malleable for actually adapting and messing around with. It's harder for a consumer to mess around with a patent. It gets messed around by other firms. Yes, they can mess around with industrial designs, but people's music, people's writing, people's logos, they can get messed around with much more easily. The Burberry check mark, and so on and so on. And they can get messed around in good ways and bad ways. And so what we wanted to do was to study lots and lots of these examples and check the sort of reaction that it had, the reaction that the firms had towards them, the legal and branding reactions, not the innovation reactions, and then get a sense of whether that was good for the brands in terms of helping the brand to be built, or whether it created a backlash.
Is there a sense of everything's moving in one direction, or is it? I mean, you described, you gave some very extreme examples of the Burberry versus the J.K. Rowling. Is that where things are going to, from what you've seen, is that where things are going? That we will always have this very tightly controlled world, and yet there's also going to be greater strides. And I'm thinking of things like 3D printing and some of the other digital technologies that will allow the sorts of dynamics you're talking about to become even more prevalent, putting it in more people's hands. We're going to get better and smarter at it. So the risk, if you like, is going to increase, the dynamics going to increase. Is this what we're going to see, a sort of more bifurcated world where there will still be this quote unquote lockdown, but there's likely to be a greater sense of freedom in some respects?
I think firms need to understand that they need to have some control, but is it classic closed control where the firm alone controls the brand? The firm alone does it, or is it more open control where the firm embraces the co-creation of the brand? In some cases, just lets consumers do what they want to do. In some cases, actually enables them and gives them, tools and technology and permission. How do firms just view consumers as passive purchasers and users of their brand and intellectual property, or do firms start recognizing more and more that individuals and groups and communities, they will do what they want with your brand? Because in terms of what is the approach to IP? Do you sort of tolerate it and permit it, or even facilitate it? Or do you just keep shutting it down? And what is the locus of value? Is the locus of value, yes, the R&D department, the marketing department, and the legal department, or do you recognize that your consumers can turn your products, if they like them and if they feel emotionally attached to them, they can turn them into legendary, products which have a value which goes on and on and on and on in ways that maybe your marketing people and your R&D people couldn't.
And I think that takes us nicely into another area that I know you've been looking at, which is the world of social media. And obviously, social media is a good example of where some of these dynamics occur. If we think about people using music tracks, taking movie clips and subverting in that space. I wonder, could you just give us some sort of thoughts on social media? Because you've been looking at sort of the dynamics of it, how the dark side of it. What are your sort of broad thoughts on it? I mean, it's here to stay, clearly, but how do you see it?
Social media, is very, one of the reasons why there's so much more user innovation and firms are able to actually see it is because of social media. They can see what people do in terms of celebrating brands, and they're able to track it, help firms celebrate it, help companies, users celebrate it, or if they want to, shut it down. Most of the instances, of user innovation that firms stumble across, they see, on Facebook or Twitter, so social media is very, very powerful. But you have to be careful in terms of the extent to which you are perceived to be controlling, monitoring, stalking, in terms of, and that's the world that we're in. We're in a world where we, when I did my PhD, we were moving from, a computer in every office to a computer in every home, and now we have computers in our pockets and on our wrists. We're going to have a world soon where we have computers in us, and the thing about social media is it's a platform, and so it allows people to add on to it, and those platforms are very controlling interfaces in terms of controlling value and controlling activity. So I'll just give you an example. Is that if you look at the cell phone, when you bought your first cell phone, the people who made all the money, the organizations that made most of the money out of cell phones, was Nokia and Ericsson and Motorola, and British Telecom or whoever was your cell phone provider. And the same with me. And there's those organizations, the telecom carrier and the cell phone maker, still play big roles in the ecosystem. But now this device is just a platform for you to do whatever. It's a platform for me to talk to you. It's a platform for me to rent cars, to book flights. And the organizations that control those platforms, and they're largely Google and Apple, they make phones now. and the telecom companies get a lot less share of the pie. And the pie has become so big because of all the apps that are on these platforms, including social media apps, in terms of controlling. And so the world of user innovation is facilitated by these platforms. It's not just social media, but it's the hardware interface which allows people to innovate and share, for it to be monitored, to be tracked, and then also for firms to stalk, track, and maybe take appropriate or inappropriate action depending on whether they like the desirable creative act or they don't like it.
On the one hand, social media looks like a great platform where we can do what we want. On the other hand, there are controls put in place either by governments or the platforms themselves. There's the whole question about algorithms and what we get shown and how that gets filtered. So it's a fascinating, on the one hand, again, we take this dynamic of sort of creativity and freedom and ability to express oneself, And, the thing you're saying, well, people buy fans of your product are going to do or people that don't like your product are going to do things with it anyway. And we've got that similar sort of element in social media. We think of it as having freedom in the same way that I think if I buy a piece of music, well, I can do what I want with it. But actually there's a law that says I can't. And so we're sort of stretching that. Social media, similar sorts of dynamics where there's freedom and yet there isn't.
Yes, and I think on that note, my experience of social media, and I'm, as you pointed out, I'm someone who's quite active on social media, following, broadcasting, engaging, is mostly done in parts of the world where there are freedoms still. My ideas about social media and my, ideas about freedom of social media might be very different in other jurisdictions. China, for example, it might be very different. It might be much more controlling, and people might feel they don't have the same freedom to say what they want and do what they want because it's already controlled in a certain way. The important thing is, as us as consumers and people who are user innovators, must always be cognizant, that they have this powerful tool, but it could be controlled in ways which stifle, limit, and shut you down. It's liberating on the one hand, but it depends on your jurisdiction. It depends on where you are, and I'm largely operating in North America and Canada and in Europe, where there are a lot more freedoms, but those freedoms are somewhat being challenged because we don't know what the large platform ecosystems are necessarily doing and the damage they're doing by allowing people the freedoms to do things.
And it occurred to me that this is another example of things that firms need to engage with. So you could pretend social media is not there. And there are some companies that have clearly adopted the approach of we'll ignore it. We'll sort of put it in the too difficult box, or that we're not that sort of business. And yet, of course, regardless of whether you're on social media as a business, people are talking about you. There is a dialogue going on. There are things happening, a conversation around your brand. And so this is another example, I think, of sort of firms have to engage with something that's uncomfortable, that they may not have previously formulated a strategy around, that is a little bit wild, wild west in the sense of you will see things that you might not ever have seen, that you might not want to see, some things that will amaze and astound you. And so I'm intrigued by your thoughts on how the dynamic. I mean, how should firms think about tackling this topic? There's you see examples of them doing what I think is really well. That's based on my echo chamber, obviously. But there's others where you just go, that was not a smart strategy. And there's others you think, why the hell haven't you? Some of them don't even have websites. And you sort of go, well, you'll get with the pro. How are you looking at this as a sort of business challenge?
For businesses, you be guided, I would say, by your strategy and be guided by the truth, evidence-based truth in terms of what you're saying. And so, if you make statements, about products and services and value, which are just made up online. If you watch it on TV, if you see something on TV and many people think that is complete BS, well, then they would just shout at their TV. They would shout at the person.
I love how you didn't say the word.
And they would just shout at the people next to them in terms of in the room, and that would be it. That would be your echo chamber. Who's in your room. But now, when you see things online, now you can write it, and it's tracked, and you can retweet it, and you can reshare it. And if you have followers who feel the same, they reshare it, and then all of a sudden, it becomes be guided by strategy, be guided by value, but be guided by evidence-based truth in terms of what you say and what you preach. Because if you can be called out for it, you will be called out for it, and it will be a backlash, and it can be a damaging backlash. And so there's lots of instances, and we have these, and they're records. They're kept. One of the putting politics to one side in terms of whatever your political allegiance is. One of the Twitter accounts I like following most is Led by Donkeys. In terms of and I like what they do in terms of, but they monitor what leaders have said, and they publicly remind the world what leaders said in terms of their advertising campaign to show where you flip-flop or where you just made stuff up or where you were just spouting bullshit because you just wanted to have your agenda. And so Led by Donkeys, is a campaign movement which continually wants to remind, yes, it has a political agenda, but it wants to remind, the UK population, that's where it focuses, what leaders said and how it had no substance and no validity. And so when you're talking about studying politics, if firms were to do that too often and too much, they would go out of business very quickly, or the leaders leading those firms would be replaced too quickly.
And I think that belongs to really, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes for people to look at, because I think it's creatively very smart, but also very biting. And I love the fact that, this is a very simple thing where they literally buy up billboards and put up tweets that people have put out that you can verify if you want to online. So stuff people have actually said, and in some cases deleted, but there's a record, it's out there. I find this really this fascinating because it's a very 21st century way of holding people to account. So the irony in many respects is if you sort of look at, people talk about manipulation and the negative side of social media, but what you've just highlighted is actually it's a fantastic record in a way that I think probably we would have historically used newspapers, but given the bias in some of those, we can't necessarily trust that. So I think this is a really interesting example of a case study for social media acting in a way that one wouldn't naturally think of, but it is the record of what people have said. And therefore, just the act of putting a tweet up on a billboard, supremely powerful way of holding people to account.
And we need to be, because part of, you look at a lot of the research on social media, it talks about, how we get cognitive overload, information overload. And part of it is drowning out, evidence-based statements with bullshit-based statements, and so we only have so much processing power, and so that's why it can dominate in terms of what rhetoric comes up in terms of, and so led by donkeys, as you said, it's very creative. They're very clever in terms of where they position their billboards and how they showcase it. They don't just do billboards; they do projections on the side of important buildings. Very clever one about Sainsbury's. So point out Sainsbury's, in terms of Sainsbury's, in terms of how Sainsbury's have people values and they appreciate diversity and et cetera. And then they remind Sainsbury's that they are advertising their company on shows which are associated with no diversity and no tolerance and and so they want to go around reminding people of these inconsistencies, and so that's an interesting way which social media works.
So, looking at sort of the challenges business face, all of this stuff makes it. On the one hand, I'm struck that it makes it a damn sight harder. Right, you've got a load more things to think about, police issues to deal with, and potentially you've got to reflect on audiences that you might not have intended. So there can be people can cause you trouble that you wouldn't naturally be speaking to because they become aware they have a voice. So on the one hand, there's a heck of a lot more things to think about. On the other hand, as you point out, actually, if you are running an ethical, transparent, sensible business and doing normal things and being honest and open, i.e. basic human decency, then in a way, you don't have that much to worry about. And I'm always struck by the sort of, there's a lot of noise around it. On the other hand, all we're doing is shining a light on what you're doing and getting a little bit more transparency.
Yeah, and if you're trying to misdirect, deceive, dissemble, fool, in terms of, because that will suit your business, that will suit your decision making, then there'll be records out there. And if people, communities, nations want to have issues with it, they are well equipped to do that in ways that they weren't before.
And what are your thoughts on regulation of social media? I mean, having looked at it, I'm guessing you're going to say that something is necessary, but how would you see that?
I would not be unhappy if more regulation occurred, because of how influential and how controlling it is. And the control and influence is not by the platforms themselves. It's just that the platforms are very powerful and others can use them to control and influence. And so, it's going to creep, and it's going to be a battle. And it's I don't think Facebook and Twitter and other platforms, should be authorities. They should be doing things that are right, and they should be concerned about it. But but it should be the jurisdictions of the world should decide, how they want. I don't think we should have the same sort of controls that maybe there exist in China in terms of social media control, where like Google's blocked and Facebook's blocked, and it's less damaging to government communications. It's much more controlled. I would assume that there's going to be regulations within different jurisdictions which try to minimize the dark side of social media in terms of what it does to children, what it does to cyberbullying, what it does to being addictive use, what it does to media campaigns, what it does to political campaigns. It's going to happen, and those companies will resist it because it impacts their revenues.
I was fascinated to see the argument that Facebook were coming out with, was saying, well, if we just shut off the algorithms, then you're going to get even more fake information. It was like this sort of very protectionist argument. And I mean, it occurs to me that, as you were talking, that the one thing missing off the list is sort of perpetuation of bullshit. And I think one of the things that is there seems to be there's an entire absence of fact checking built into the piece. I mean, belatedly, we're getting things that sort of, particularly when I look at COVID disinformation, where there's a belated attempt to sort of try and do something and a little bit more warning. But all of these, there is a ton of bullshit on social media.
Yeah, and there was a ton of bullshit on TV, and and there still is,
yeah.
And there still is, and in the newspapers, and in conversations we have with our friends and families and neighbors, and so it's part of the fabric of life. But television, for example, and broadcasting and publishing, newspaper, they've had controls which mean that you can't sort of make fake claims, and you can be in trouble for making fake claims. And so, and the extent to which an individual who's just having a voice and freedom of speech makes a fake claim, it's not a paid advert which might be controlled by an advertising authority. But an influencer, for example, has millions and millions of followers, and influencers are paid and supported by brands. These are things which the echo chambers just got more big, more intertwined. They're faster. As I said before, the echo chamber before 20 years ago was just what you screamed at your TV when you were, when you liked something or didn't like something, and who was in the room with you, and then how you went to work and how you shared that and discussed that over a tea break or a working shift, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you re-like, you share, you add to, you move it. It's much more, and the world is going to track this and study this and understand this, and in the same way as it took 40 years for people really to understand that smoking was bad for you, because there was a lot of pushback by the companies who were funding that research. It may take a few decades for us to really understand how bad and how negative this is before we wake up and pass rules and regulations which reduce the dark side of it.
And having spent some time looking at it, how has your behavior and sort of personal perspective on social media changed?
So for me, social media has displaced all other forms of procrastination for me. So whatever I did before, I don't play Candy Crush. I don't do, I don't look out the window, as much as I should. It's sort of, social media is when I stop working, when I'm traveling or commuting, when I'm waiting to catch a plane and stuff. And so it's also displaced reading for pleasure. I read lots of pleasurable things via social media, but it makes me think about my academic research a lot more. Academics are paid to do research for other academics. We're writing in journals and we're joining those conversations. But as a publicly funded scholar, so my salary is largely publicly funded. Much of the research income I get comes from the public. It's really made me want to share my research with the public in more digestible ways. sometimes in clickbaitable ways where I want you to be interested in the research, but not where I'm misstating, or at least deliberately not misstating anything in the paper or the research, and making it more digestible. I blog, I do video explainers, I share slide decks. I want to make my research digestible for the public, so that they can get energized by it and maybe even act on it, in terms. And it also reminds me, occasionally, I do research which is sometimes useful and interesting, and I sometimes do research which is not useful and interesting, and that process of actually, and by useful and interesting I mean useful and interesting to non-academics, and so, and it really helps improve my teaching, because it helps me, think about the all the new knowledge being created in the areas of innovation and operations, and how to frame it into important current lessons based on that knowledge for, undergraduates, graduates, and executives I work with. So I found it a very good way of calibrating, what I think is important to work on in the world, and then as a consequence, it's become intrinsically quite rewarding in that regard.
And I want to absolutely encourage you to do that. And one of the reasons I came across you, I think, is because you were very good at doing that, and it's only got sort of better and more. As you say, you've been using a broader range tool. So I absolutely want to encourage that. And I think it's fascinating when you talk, because it struck me there were parallels really to companies trying to sort of protect IP. If you look at traditionally research, where, how would that get out into the public domain? Well, a lot of it's behind paywalls, which the public doesn't have access to. So how do I find out? Well, I'll find out if I happen to read something in a newspaper where a journalist stumbled on some research that supports the story they're looking at. Or I guess in a COVID type situation, there may be research that sort of is the story itself. But broadly speaking, or road safety or those sorts of issues. But what I find really fascinating is you've kind of broken that down. And as you say, it is democratizing in many respects access to academic thinking and helping us to, I read these things because I'm a bit of a geek on the behavioral science and why do we do what we do side, and take that. But the average person isn't spending their time reading academic research. It wouldn't occur to me. You wouldn't do it in the same way that you read a newspaper. You might read a specialist magazine or blog for the subject you're interested in, but having access to these things has historically been quite difficult. And I think that's a really interesting shift that you've mentioned, where I see that happening. I mean, there are academics that sit in ivory towers, but there's a lot of the dynamic you're talking about. And it seems to me that's in some respects similar to what we were talking about before, around companies having to open up about their products and engage with a wider audience that perhaps they're not used to engaging in that way with.
That's so spot on, Chris. Absolutely spot on a number of levels, and particularly how you finished off, because the paper, which is the piece of work that's currently dominating me the most, is the title of the paper. I'm just remember it is called "Being an Open Academic: How to Use Social Media to Be More Open." And so it combines this notions of open innovation and open brandings, and trying to. It's a paper for my colleagues, so it's a paper for fellow academics, whether they be PhD students, postdocs, or senior professors, to make them think about the issues that you have just so nicely summarized. In terms of, if you were lucky enough, your research may get picked up by your university media office, and they write a page on their webpage about your work, and they may even send out a news announcement which gets picked up by hopefully some good agencies, but often all of these sort of second tier, third tier news publications in terms of going forward. And I, before, when I was first getting into social media within the business school I was working in Vancouver, there was a very good media officer, and he was very pro social media, and the art of him interviewing me and turning my research into little newsworthy pieces, which I could then review and correct inaccuracies and everything else, was what got me on this role. But that doesn't happen very often, and often, the media offices of universities and newspapers themselves, they just want to create a buzz, and that's important. And maybe the statements about what is important or correct within the research get lost or and so as a scholar you have the platform now to write your own pieces. You can write them on blogs, you can share them on a personal web page, there are also media platforms such as the Medium, the Conversation, which want academics to join news conversations by sharing the latest research and findings, and they help you to write it. And so you use this term, sort of the democratization of sort of academic dissemination. That's certainly what's happening, and I've enjoyed doing that. And you get feedback, and it helps you understand to what extent you have done something which is interesting beyond, being interesting to the important knowledge creation processes within academia. And it's important to say, I'm not saying that you should be completely open as an academic, because the ivory tower is important. The ivory tower protects you. It protects you from too much undue influence. It gives you solitude to think. The ivory tower allows you to be disconnected to think. But the dark side of that is you become disconnected, and so in some cases, that disconnection is great for generating wonderful ideas and research, which can be so important to academia and the world. But on the other cases, you're just disconnected, and your mission of an academic who's producing new knowledge and educating people who will make the world a better place becomes an elusive ideal.
That's lovely. I'd never thought about the sort of positive aspects of ivory towers, because it is always, you're right, when it's used, it's a very negative connotation of sort of, don't know what's going on in the real world type logic. And I think, as you explained that, I thought, well, we wouldn't want people sort of half-assedly releasing scientific results. I mean, let's take vaccines as a good example. I want to make sure they've done their job properly before this thing goes out in the public, or even advice on how we should behave. And so that same logic of, look, let's get this thing sorted before we go public with it is very important. So there is a reason why there are peer reviews and things take time to emerge. And I think that sometimes runs contrary in our, nowadays, you should have an opinion on everything, shoot from the hip, we expect you to have a view on things world, and instant response and instant gratification. And those two things sort of run against each other. But I like that articulation you made, actually, where I think there's room for both of those things, which is have that space to think. And that, after all, is why we need you in society, because the rest of us have other things to be getting on with. So reflect on that. But I like that articulation of how we then bridge that gap, and how do we then make this thing useful? Because I think there's a ton of stuff that is sitting locked up, literally in the tower, that none of us gets to see. That'd actually be great if we could.
And you mentioned something which I think I'd like to pick up on, which is, a good academic and a good leader, I think, is well prepared to often say to questions, I don't know. And so, I think a good professor in a classroom, when asked questions by students, shouldn't have to shoot from the hip, shouldn't have to do things. You say, I don't know, but let's think this through. Let's consider what could be the answer, but I don't know. That's a really good question. And I think leaders and academics are more trained to this, and you should see more academics saying, I don't know, in the media and in the classroom. But leaders should also, and also people reporting to leaders, there should be a culture of where if you don't know, you don't know. You might have a hypothesis or a hunch which you want to explore and develop, but being brave enough and having a profession and a culture which encourages and allow. Obviously you don't want the answer to every question being I don't know. Because then you might be in the wrong job or the wrong profession in terms of going forward. But you shouldn't be afraid to say I don't know sometimes.
And I think that's fascinating, right? Because I think we have a lot of people talking who really shouldn't be, right? Saying that, well, you might politely term bullshit, right? But you then got the flip side of people that really do know some stuff that don't have the opportunity to speak up about it, and who are sitting on really useful information that can't find their voice for whatever reason.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, that was, the shift that you made from, the start of this being about open branding, and open branding being the sort of next stage of open innovation, to being an open academic. That was really nicely done, Christian. So yeah, that reflects a lot reflects what's going on in my life and my career at the moment.
Fantastic. And so you've talked about that piece of research that you're doing for your colleagues, which I will take a keen interest in because I'm going to hold that up. So anybody that doesn't want to come on the podcast, I will be throwing the Ian McCarthy thing at them and saying, read this. This is why you should do this. And then they'll tell me it's personal to do with my podcast. But that's a second discussion. But what else is on your plate? Because I always sense, Ian, that you have this very broad agenda of lots of things, all of which I find really interesting, and sort of just there's a natural curiosity, and I wonder where does that take you beyond that exercise?
So I'm a little bit different than the traditional business school professor. Originally I was an engineering professor at the University of Sheffield and the University of Warwick, and had some great mentors there. And I moved, and I was always doing management of engineering in those schools, and so I've always been management orientated. When I joined a business school, it was to sort of learn the craft of doing business school research. But all the way through, I tended to work with people I like and on projects I like. And so I am a bit eclectic in terms of, and I wouldn't advise that for everybody because there are costs, in terms of stretching yourself and learning and being in different areas. And there are rewards to being focused and just being more narrow and more specialized, particularly institutional rewards. That's how the academia is, is focused more in terms of disciplines rather than being too multidisciplinary. But the papers I'm working on at the moment, and I will mention 3, and apologies to other co-authors if I didn't. I'm looking at research misconduct. So looking at papers which have been retracted because they did something wrong. They plagiarized, they made up results. And so with the world of digitization, it's much easier to track and monitor this. And we've got a big database of about 20,000 articles that have been retracted. And so this is a big topic, but we wanted to look at different levels of misconduct, different levels of transgression. And so we were able to code and we want to see, is misconduct on the rise because it's, because we're publishing more than ever and we are able to spot it more than ever, and it is on the rise because of those reasons. But it's also on the rise because of the pressures to publish or perish. We wanted to see to what extent it varies between disciplines. So this database of retracted articles, 20,000 retracted articles, goes across all disciplines. That's the first stage. We then want to look at it maybe in terms of looking at the quality of the institutions, where you did your PhD, in terms of, and I said there's the level, there are different levels of transgression, and they range from sort of out and out, right, blatant misconduct to just sloppiness, like errors and stuff, and so it's retracted for these reasons. And the sloppiness would be, not hardcore misconduct, but sort of questionable misconduct. And the other ones would be ones where you would lose your job, maybe even get sued by people because you produce work, and in the world of social media, and digital tracking of information, we also know that even when papers get retracted, they have what's called a zombie afterlife. People still keep using them and referring to them and stuff in terms of even though they've been discredited or retracted. That's one paper. And this is going to really reveal how the second paper is going to reveal how another project I was in. I'm a big football fan. I support the best team in the world, which is Everton, and
going through interesting times at the moment. But I'm sure we'll be back.
And so, I was looking at the data a while back of the voting data for the world's best football players, male football player data I was looking at, and I was looking, there was always, this is going back a few years now, we've been going on with this study for a bit, but you could see that the top 3 or 4 candidates were, the usual suspects. They were Ronaldo, Neymar, and Messi. But you could see who voted for who. So here's a question for you, and they asked 3 people to vote. They asked the captain of the national team to vote, the manager or the coach of the national team to vote, and they choose one esteemed reporter, journalist in every country to vote. So every country around the world gets 3 votes: the national team coach, the national team captain, and an esteemed reporter. And so what sort of triggered me was when you'd look at everyone's voting for these three players, and I looked at who at the time Steven Gerrard was when we first got the data. He was the national team captain, so you can see how far back the study went. Who do you think Steven Gerrard voted for to be, number one best player in the world in the FIFA World Player Award?
Well, I'm assuming he's going to back his own man, so David Beckham probably, or someone either an England person or a Liverpool player.
So the latter. So who would be the latter? So club versus country. So this is club versus country versus national team. But it wasn't. He didn't go for David Beckham. He went for someone on his team.
I'm assuming he's going to Jamie Carragher or someone like that.
Suarez.
Ah, there we go.
Okay. And then you would look at this, and I started looking at who was voting, and I was seeing all of this political bias in voting, and so. And so I went down a rabbit hole of looking at all this data, and I wanted to measure using cultural measures how far countries are apart geographically, how far they are apart culturally. What are the voting? So it's a bit like Eurovision Song Contest,
right? I was going to say it's
so it's a bit like the Eurovision Song Contest. Once you get beyond the top 3 or 4 candidates, then there's a whole bunch of voting dynamics where, Spanish-speaking countries tend to vote for Spanish-speaking players and so on and so on, and, Northern European countries and African countries. And we wanted to explore whether the bias was country-based or club-based or some other cultural index-based. So that's the other paper.
Wow, I tell you what, as a Bayern Munich fan, I cannot wait to read it, because I'm furious that Robert Lewandowski hasn't got anywhere near the credits he deserved because of exactly that. So I will read that with absolute fascination. Right? Wow. And then the third one.
The third one is doing work with a former MBA student who is a medical doctor in a hospital in Vancouver, and very smart, very driven professional and MBA student, and during times of COVID was looking at patient flows and allocating patients and changing bed capacity and basically working in an ER unit. And so it's about trying to minimize the outbreak of COVID within hospitals, and how when patients turn up with suspected COVID infections, they get categorized into what's called a traffic light system, where green is they have little or no chance and maybe have been confirmed as having not COVID. Yellow is, or amber, they're suspect, and red is they're very, very likely. And they would go in different journeys and different beds within the hospital. And so imagine, this is about making hospitals much more reconfigurable. And so 1 week you might have a lot more red cases, and so therefore you got to adjust the number of people who work in red beds and red parts of the wards. And it's all about trying to minimize. And so we're trying to prove that this approach. So we've been studying it, and we've been looking at it, and we've been looking at forecasting data, and so when the COVID conditions change in the environment, how should this impact how hospitals forecast and allocate red, amber, or green conditions in terms of bed capacity and who works in those bed areas, and then how that improves. Improving means minimizing the transmission of the disease within hospitals, and that means that healthcare workers don't get sick, and it doesn't hurt healthcare health and doesn't hurt hospital capacity.
Wow. That's like a smorgasbord of subjects that deal with, from the sort of the lighthearted and fun through to the deadly serious and incredibly important. And I love that. And that I think that's given listeners more than enough reasoning to follow you on social media, because there's generally something there for everybody, and it's all fascinating stuff. So firstly, thank you for all those things that you do. I thank you for the work on bullshit, which has been amazing and makes me smile every time I look at it. But as hopefully listeners will have gleaned today, you're covering a whole range of things that I think are just really interesting topics. And you do it in such an engaging and human way, which I think is the key piece. And it's why I absolutely love having you on the show. So thank you so much for all of that.
Thank you, Christian. It's a pleasure. And I've really enjoyed talking with you again today.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Ian for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more details about Ian and the various research projects that we mentioned, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there. There's also a link to the previous episode when Ian appeared, talking in more detail about his research into workplace bullshit. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a 5-star rating for it on your platform of choice, please do so. It really does help promote the show, and that in turn allows me to continue to attract high-quality guests to appear on it. To find out more about human risk, to subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter, watch the Human Risk video blog, and find other resources, as well as information on the work that I do with clients to help them manage their human risk, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon, but in the meantime, remember to be counterintuitive in your thinking, steer clear of workplace bullshit, and above all, stay safe, and thanks for listening.